Hey guys, tonight we begin with someone important to history. The medieval peasant, the unsung hero of Europe, the backbone of the economy, the human lab rat who tested every food, plague, and famine nature threw at them, mostly without surviving it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. If you truly want to eat like a medieval peasant, you must start your day the way they did, by waking up and immediately regretting it. Dawn arrives with a rooster that screams like it's being murdered, a sound designed to remind you that joy is a sin and sleep is a luxury you'll never afford. You rise from your straw mattress, which has all the comfort of a sack filled with broken twigs and whatever insects moved in overnight. Now breakfast. You approach the hearth where the cottage lives, and I do mean lives. This thing has been simmering longer than you've been alive. It's a family heirloom in the worst way. Every morning, water is added to thin the prehistoric sludge at the bottom. Ingredients: whatever the household didn't starve to death. Eating yesterday, grains, beans, roots, and the occasional mystery chunk that might be vegetable or might not. The pot is never fully cleaned. Medieval peasants didn't wash dishes. They just kept boiling until the bacteria either died or achieved sainthood. The flavor profile is complex. Imagine if depression had a taste. Imagine warm mud but angrier. Imagine chewing something and thinking, this definitely has a history. If you're lucky, someone throws in a carrot. Not for nutrition, just for morale. A bright orange speck of hope in a sea of beige despair. Then you've got bread, a medieval delicacy made of reflour, water, and pure contempt. Dense, dark, and capable of breaking not just teeth, but generational morale. Milling was so inefficient that bits of stone regularly ended up baked into the loaf. Congratulations, your breakfast now doubles as dental Russian roulette. Next comes the drink. Children, adults, elders, everyone sips weak ale. Not because they're trying to party at 5 a.m., but because medieval water was basically a gamble with cholera. Weak ale is safe, mildly fizzy, and gives you the tiny buzz required to tolerate peasants' #1 breakfast spice: disappointment. No fruit, no eggs, no cheese, unless it's older than your memories. You swallow your pottage, soften your bread, brick, and beer, and contemplate whether life before agriculture was actually the better option. And that's breakfast, a perfect preview of your entire medieval day. Underseasoned, structurally questionable, and emotionally damaging, yet somehow survivable. If breakfast pottage didn't break your spirit, the bread certainly will. Medieval peasant bread wasn't just food, it was a geological experience. Forget soft loaves, golden crusts, and that warm bakery smell that makes modern people believe in goodness. Peasant bread smelled faintly of earth, mildew, and the deep sigh of someone who gave up halfway through baking it. Let's talk ingredients. Medieval peasants didn't have wheat unless the Lord accidentally dropped some. Their bread was made of rye, the hardy, bitter, slightly resentful cousin of wheat. In lean years, rye was stretched by adding things that should never be in bread: ground beans, acorns, tree bark, wild grasses, and whatever plant looked the least poisonous that day. And then there's millstone grit, the secret medieval seasoning nobody asked for. Grain was ground between stone wheels, which shed little pieces of rock into the flour. So every loaf of bread was basically a medieval jawbreaker, TM, designed to slowly file down your teeth until they resembled chalk nubs. Archaeologists constantly find medieval skeletons with tooth enamel worn down like pebbles in a river. Congratulations, that was from breakfast. This is why medieval peasants didn't need dentists. Their bread was the dental procedure. Now texture. Picture a loaf so dense it can double as personal protection in a tavern brawl. Bread wasn't sliced, it was negotiated with. Some peasants softened it in ale, others soaked it in pottage. A few brave fools attempted to bite into it dry and promptly left their dental legacy in the crust. The rich had fluffy white bread, the poor had maslin, a depressing blend of rye and whatever. The miller swept off the floor. You didn't choose Maslin bread chose you. If you were truly unlucky, the rye got infected with ergot, a glowing black fungus that causes convulsions, hallucinations, and the strong belief that Satan is trying to tap dance inside your skull. Entire villages occasionally tripped together, which was the medieval equivalent of a rave, but with more screaming. But the most tragic part, bread, was the main food source. You didn't get a slice, you got a brick, multiple bricks, daily. So yes, medieval peasants didn't fear starvation. They feared chewing. If medieval peasants had one consistent joy, and joy is a strong word here, it was beer for breakfast. Not in a fun to frat boys clinking cans at 8 o'clock a.m. kind of way. No, this was survival beer. The kind you drink because every drop of water in your village is trying to assassinate you. The rivers full of animal poop. The wells full of bacteria. The rainwater barrels, excellent breeding ground for things that grow legs and crawl out at night. So peasants boiled everything, and boiling everything eventually became brewing. Thus, weak ale, breakfast's most reliable, least homicidal beverage. Now, don't imagine medieval peasants getting tipsy at sunrise and shouting philosophical insights across the fields. Weak ale was very low alcohol, just enough to make it safe, not enough to make you charismatic. It tasted like someone whispered the idea of beer into a bucket of warm water. But hey, it was wet. It didn't kill you. And it sometimes masked the flavor of your daily bread, brick. Children drank it too. Yes, medieval toddlers were pounding tiny tankers of ale before they could pronounce their own names. This explains both medieval handwriting and medieval decision. It also explains why nobody during that era had any concept of hydration or basic health. The brewing process itself was flexible. Every household had its own microbrewery, which is a romantic way of saying a clay pot with dubious hygiene standards. Yeast. They didn't understand it, but they definitely angered it often. Grain quality varied, water quality. Let's not talk about it. But the end result was always the same. Drinkable liquid that didn't immediately cause dysentery. On feast days, ale was stronger, the good stuff, the kind of beer that made you forget you were surfbound to a landlord who believed bathing was witchcraft. But that wasn't breakfast beer. Breakfast beer was the responsible sibling, plain, watery, and vaguely bread-flavored. A liquid reminder that life is a marathon of disappointment. In some places, peasants drank small beer, even weaker than weak ale, essentially barley-flavored sadness. But it kept them hydrated, kept them alive, and kept them mildly buzzed enough to tolerate the fact that their day involved 14 hours of unpaid farm labor. So yes, before coffee, before orange juice, before morning routines, medieval peasants woke up, stretched, and drank beer like it was water. Because it was by mid-morning the medieval peasant has already been awake for 5 or 6 hours, plowing fields, feeding animals, hauling water, and questioning every life choice their ancestors made. Naturally, this is the perfect time for a snack, which in peasant terms means something mildly edible you can hide in your pocket. This meal is not really a meal. It is whatever you managed to scavenge before the rooster finished ruining your morning. There is no cheese platter, no trail mix, no fruit bowl with a sprinkle of optimism. Instead, your mid-morning snack is usually one of 3 things. A raw onion. Yes, an onion. Just the onion eaten like an apple. Tears streaming down your face. Not because the onion is spicy, but because this is your life now. Medieval peasants lived in a perpetual state of crying and pretending it was fine. A small lump of cheese, but not the nice kind of cheese. This is the kind of cheese that squeaks when you cut it and has the emotional energy of an abandoned boot. It is either very young and therefore slimy, or very old and therefore capable of breaking a wagon wheel if dropped. No one knows how old the cheese is. No one asks. Asking questions in the Middle Ages was dangerous. Bread that should be illegal. Leftover Maslin bread from yesterday. Already hard enough to kill a man. For a snack, you don't slice it. You chip pieces off like a sculptor removing stone from a block. It's portable, durable, and doubles as emergency building material. Sometimes, for variety, peasants brought peas or broad beans, still raw and still disappointing. Occasionally, a lucky soul found a bit of leftover salted fish, which they chewed throughout the day like the world's saddest protein bar. And let's not forget the travel accessory of the medieval working class. The food pouch, a leather bag that smells like regret, sweat, and 3 previous generations of mid-morning snacks. This snack does not boost morale, it does not restore energy, it simply delays death. The point is not satisfaction. The point is staying alive long enough to eat more pottage later. Peasants rarely sat down to enjoy this meal. They ate while walking, sweating, or digging. Medieval life was one long workout with none of the health benefits. So yes, the mid-morning snack is not a break. It is a cry for help, disguised as cheese. By the time lunch arrives, the medieval peasant has already completed what modern people would call an entire day's worth of labor. They have plowed, planted, hauled, chopped, shoveled, milked, sweated, and possibly cried in a field where no one could see them. Lunch is the reward for all this effort, which would be wonderful if the reward weren't pottage. Again, lunch in the Middle Ages is not a meal you look forward to. It is a meal you accept. You approach it the way one approaches bad weather or a tax collector, with quiet resignation and the knowledge that resistance is pointless. The midday pottage is the same as the morning pottage, except now it's slightly hotter and slightly more resentful. The flavors haven't improved. They've simply had more time to become aware of their own existence. You sit on the ground because chairs are for people who have money and fewer spinal problems. Before you is a wooden bowl filled with a stew so thick that some peasants could, and often did, stand a spoon upright in it. The ingredients haven't changed. It's still barley, beans, and whatever vegetables were bullied into growing that season. The only difference is the portion size, just enough to keep you working, but not enough to make you happy. If by some miracle you have meat, it's never a proper cut. It's usually a thin strip of salt pork, cured so aggressively it could survive a nuclear winter. This meat isn't tender, it isn't juicy, it's a challenge. You chew it for so long that you begin to question whether it was ever alive. But peasants considered it a treat, because compared to everything else they ate, this at least had a flavor, even if that flavor was salt and despair. Bread sometimes makes a midday appearance, though at this point in the day, it has, somehow, become even harder. The crust feels like the exterior of a medieval fortress. Soaking it in pottage helps, but only in the same way soaking a brick in water makes it slightly less of a brick. Lunch does not refresh you, it does not energize you, but it prevents you from collapsing in the field, which is the main requirement. After eating, you stand up with knees that sound like church doors opening and return to work, fueled by nothing but determination and a digestive system built for suffering. Eating like a medieval peasant meant living at the mercy of the seasons, and the seasons were not merciful. Each one brought its own unique brand of culinary disappointment, a rotating menu of scarcity, wilted produce, and the constant fear that this year's harvest might simply give up and die out of spite. Summer was, in theory, the good season. Crops were growing, animals were alive, and there was sunlight to remind you the world wasn't entirely built out of gloom. But even summer peasants didn't eat like kings. They had peas, beans, leeks, and maybe a cabbage if the local pests hadn't held a rave in the garden. Everything was fresh, yes, but fresh in the sense that it had been pulled from the dirt 40 minutes ago and still tasted like it. Summer meals were bright, green, and profoundly boring, but at least there was food. Then came autumn, a season peasants both loved and feared. Harvest time meant work so brutal your spine wanted to file a complaint. But it also meant the best meals of the year: root vegetables, fruits, nuts, mushrooms, and anything nature hadn't hidden too well. The problem was storage. Peasants preserved food with salt, smoke, cellars, or blind optimism. And optimism, it turns out, does not prevent mold. Many autumn delicacies were simply summer ingredients that had lost their will to live. Winter was the real villain of the medieval diet. Once the frost arrived, your meals became a series of edible survival tactics. Salted fish, salted pork, salted everything. If it wasn't salted, it wasn't safe. Winter vegetables included turnips that tasted like sadness and onions that could be used as self-defense weapons. Bread grew harder, pottage grew thinner, hope grew faint. Yes, there were feast days, but one day of roasted meat didn't make up for 90 days of culinary despair. Finally, spring, also known as the hungry season. The food stores from winter were nearly empty. New crops weren't ready. Animals were still depressingly skinny. This was the season where peasants ate weeds, not trendy foraged greens, but weeds. Whatever grew first became dinner, whether it tasted edible or resembled punishment. So yes, peasants ate seasonally, but not in the modern influencer sense. Their seasonal menu wasn't curated by personal preference. It was curated by famine, frostbite, and the ongoing war between humans and nature, a war nature often won. A medieval peasant's vegetable garden was not the cheerful Instagram-worthy oasis modern people imagine. There were no raised beds, no heirloom tomatoes, no basil plants in cute clay pots. The peasant garden was a battlefield, a desperate struggle between humans and nature, in which nature usually won by a landslide. This garden, if we're generous enough to call it that, consisted of a small fenced patch of soil filled with vegetables chosen not for taste, but for their ability to endure suffering. Medieval vegetables weren't picky. They grew in terrible soil, under terrible conditions, and tasted accordingly. Flavor was not a priority. Survival was the superstar of the garden, was the turnip. Not because anyone liked turnips. No one in history has ever genuinely liked a turnip, but because they were nearly impossible to kill. Drought, turnips survived. Frost, turnips survived. Beating it with a stick, probably still survived. They were the cockroaches of medieval produce. Next came leeks, the medieval version of seasoning, even though they tasted like sadness dipped in onion. Peasants pretended leeks improved their meals, but mostly leeks just existed, long and limp, waiting to be boiled into oblivion. Cabbage also made frequent appearances, usually in the form of a large, watery head that smelled like it had moral objections to being eaten. Beans and peas rounded out the garden, not the modern, crisp, sweet kind, but the medieval ones that tasted like chalk and regret. They were filling though, which made them extremely popular. Peasants didn't eat for pleasure. They ate to postpone starvation. Herbs, forget about it. Herbs were luxury items grown in the Lord's garden by the Lord's gardener, using the Lord's time, soil, and stolen peasant labor. If a commoner wanted flavor, they had two choices: salt, which was expensive, or pretending their food had flavor. More often, they chose the second option. Then came the pests: rabbits, rats, insects, birds, and anything else with a stomach. Medieval gardens were a buffet for every creature except the people who planted them. Half the harvest went to feeding nature. The other half went into pottage and disappeared without making the slightest difference to the taste. Tending the garden required hours of bending, hauling, weeding, watering, and cursing loudly at plants that refused to grow. But the payoff: a handful of vegetables with the flavor, complexity of damp cardboard. Such was the medieval garden, a triumphant act of labor, producing absolutely mediocre food. If you were a medieval peasant, meat was not a food category. It was a rumor, something whispered about around the fire in winter, something you maybe tasted once a month if God was feeling generous. Most peasants consumed so little meat that modern vegetarians would have accused them of overreacting. Let's start with the basics. The animals on your land belong to the Lord. The deer in the forest, the Lord's. The rabbits hopping around your garden like they own the place, the Lord's. The boar smashing your fence, also the Lord's. If it breathed, walked on four legs, or could be roasted, it was legally his. Killing it without permission was called poaching, which is medieval for enjoy prison or try not to lose a hand. So peasants made do with what they could eat, which usually meant pork fat, salted pork scraps, or the parts of animals nobody rich wanted. You don't get pork chops, you get a sliver of something suspiciously gelatinous, preserved so aggressively in salt, it looked like it was mummified for the afterlife. It wasn't tender, it wasn't juicy, it was a culinary dare. Chicken, rare. Chickens were valuable for their eggs. Killing one early was like setting fire to your savings account. Beef, absolutely not. Cows were too valuable, alive. Mutton only if a sheep died of stupidity, illness, or spite. If you wanted fresh meat, you waited for slaughter season, a cheerful time in late autumn when animals were killed because winter would finish them off anyway. On this glorious day, you might taste liver, kidneys, or heart. Medieval peasants didn't waste anything. If it wasn't a hoof or a moral failing, it was dinner. Fish, on the other hand, was allowed, mostly because fish were too slippery to legally belong to the Lord. Peasants ate eels, carp, and whatever else could be dragged out of a river with a net and a prayer. But fish spoiled fast, so most of it was salted until it resembled a medieval chew toy. True feasts were reserved for holy days, when everyone ate real meat, sang songs, and temporarily forgot their digestive system was being held together by pottage and determination. But everyday life, meat was a rarity, a dream, a distant memory of something delicious that other people, richer people, enjoyed regularly. For the peasant, meat was not a meal, it was an event. If medieval peasants had one reliable source of protein, calcium, and mild emotional trauma, it was cheese. But don't imagine golden wheels of cheddar or creamy wedges of brie. No, no, peasant cheese was a separate species entirely. The kind of dairy product that looked like it had survived a difficult past and wanted you to join it. Cheese began its life in the medieval world the same way most things did, out of necessity and poor storage conditions. Milk spoiled quickly. Cows produced less in winter, and everything had to be preserved. So peasants curdled milk on purpose, pressed it together, dried it, salted it, and prayed. The result was cheese, sort of. There were two major kinds, fresh cheese and aged cheese, both of which came with serious drawbacks. Fresh cheese was soft, pale, and vaguely lumpy, the dairy equivalent of a shrug. Its flavor was mild but suspicious, like something that wasn't dangerous yet, but could be if given a strong breeze or a stern look. Fresh cheese went bad faster than a medieval marriage, so peasants ate it immediately and nervously. Then there was aged cheese, hard cheese, cheese that had been sitting on a shelf for so long it had developed a personality. These wheels were dense, sharp, and capable of stopping an arrow at close range. If dropped, they could dent a table. If thrown, they could end a feud. Some historians believe ancient peasants survived winter, not because of hearty diets, but because their cheese was essentially edible armor. But texture wasn't the only concern. Cleanliness varied. Milk pails weren't sterilized, they were wiped. Curing vats were rinsed. Molds grew where they wanted. Sometimes the cheese had a little too much personality, and peasants simply cut around the part that looked like it had achieved consciousness. Despite all this, cheese was a staple. It was portable, filling, and easier to chew than bread, which for peasants was a miracle. A chunk of cheese could accompany you into the fields, last through a workday, and probably survive a minor apocalypse. Some lucky families also made whey soup, which was exactly as unappetizing as it sounds. Leftover liquid from cheesem, warmed, salted, and consumed with the enthusiasm of someone accepting their fate. Still, cheese was respected. It was valuable. It kept you alive. And most importantly, it rarely fought back. When the garden failed, the animals weren't yours, and the cottage tasted like recycled agony. Peasants turned to the last option, foraging, a medieval practice also known as walking into the woods and hoping something doesn't kill you. Foraging was essential, dangerous, and wildly unpredictable. Nature didn't care about your hunger. Nature had its own schedule, and your stomach was not on it. Yet every year, Peasants wandered through forests, hedge, and riverbanks, looking for anything edible, or anything that looked edible if you squinted hard enough. The most common finds were berries, though not the sweet variety. Modern people love medieval berries, were smaller, sour, and more suspicious. You'd pick handfuls of them, staining your fingers purple like a crime scene, and hope they didn't contain worms. If they did, peasants considered that hound bonus protein, which says everything you need to know about medieval nutrition. Then came nuts, the Nobel Prize of foraging, mostly hazelnuts and walnuts. These were precious, not just for eating, but for trading, storing, and occasionally hurling at your cousin. But gathering nuts was competitive. You weren't just fighting hunger, you were fighting squirrels. And squirrels, medieval or not, do not mess around. Herbs were also gathered, though peasants rarely knew what they were. Some leaves improved the flavor of pottage. Others sent you on a spiritual journey to meet God prematurely. Medieval herb knowledge was essentially guesswork with consequences. And then there were mushrooms, the medieval lottery. Some filled your belly, some filled your grave. Identifying mushrooms was a skill passed down through generations. But generational memory isn't perfect. Every so often, someone would confidently declare, "This one is safe." And 3 hours later, the entire village would be seeing colors that didn't exist yet. Roots like wild garlic and bok were prizes, too. But digging them up felt like participating in a low-budget archaeological dig. You'd scrape the dirt with whatever tool had broken yet, and pray the root was just another rock pretending to be food. Foraging wasn't just about eating. It was about survival. Some years, it saved entire villages. Other years, it wiped out half the population when a fungus, berry, or mushroom decided it deserved a little revenge. But despite the dangers, peasants kept foraging, crawling through brambles, dodging animals, and eating whatever the forest begrudgingly offered. Because when you're a medieval peasant, hunger isn't a feeling, it's a lifestyle. Dinner in the medieval peasant world was not a grand finale. It was not a moment of celebration or comfort. It was quite simply pottage, round 2, the sequel no one asked for, and everyone dreaded. Yet here it is again, bubbling in the same pot, waiting to greet you, like an overfamiliar acquaintance who refuses to take hints. By evening, the pottage has reached a new stage of existence. It has simmered all day, absorbing every vegetable scrap, every grain fragment, and every emotional breakdown that occurred in the kitchen. The texture is thicker now, a medieval concrete mix, and the flavor is somehow both stronger and weaker at the same time. It's a culinary paradox, dense but watery, bland but overwhelming, edible but emotionally damaging. You sit at the table, which is really just a plank of wood pretending to be furniture. Your bowl is carved from a single piece of timber, and probably still tastes faintly of tree. Everyone gets a ladleful of the pottage, though ladleful is generous. It's more like someone scoops a chunk from the pot and hopes it slides into your bowl eventually. The contents vary depending on the day. Sometimes it's barley heavy, sometimes it's turnip heavy, sometimes it's just disappoint. The vegetables have been boiled so thoroughly that they no longer possess texture, color, or foreignness. Everything becomes a beige slurry, a unified mass of edible confusion. If there is bread left over, and that's a big if, you dunk it into the pottage to soften it enough that your teeth survive. For a fleeting moment, this feels like luxury. Then the bread dissolves into the stew, and the fantasy ends. Meat in dinner pottage is a rare miracle. Maybe a hint of pork fat. Maybe a bone that has been boiled so many times its ancestors feel tired. A bone in the pot is exciting though. A bone means the stew has seen meat, and that alone can boost morale. Dinner is silent, not because it's peaceful, but because talking wastes his energy. The only sounds are the scraping of spoons and the distant groaning of someone's back as they shift on a stool that predates literacy. Once the bowls are empty, you don't feel full, just slightly less empty. Dinner does not satisfy hunger. It merely negotiates with it. But it's fuel. And tomorrow will demand more fuel, more pottage, more chewing, more survival, such as the medieval dinner. In the life of a medieval peasant, there existed a sacred and deeply cherished event known as the feast day. Not because it happened often, it didn't, but because it was the one moment in the entire year when a peasant could experience something vaguely resembling happiness. Feasts were like medieval holidays, mixed with medieval buffets, except instead of casinos or beaches, you had a churchyard and a dirt floor. A feast was usually tied to a religious celebration because the church controlled everything, including when you were allowed to enjoy yourself. And peasants took these chances seriously. They would show up early, dressed in their cleanest tunic, the one that only had 8 holes instead of 15, because a feast meant one thing: actual food. On a feast day, the tables overflowed with things peasants normally only dreamed about while gnawing on week-old bread. There was meat, actual chunks of it, not salted slivers or bone fragments. Pork roasted over an open fire, dripping with fat like some medieval miracle. Chickens stuffed with herbs. Peasants rarely saw outside the Lord's kitchen. Maybe even a bit of beef carved into thick slices and passed around like it was holy. There were pies, too. Savory pastries filled with meat, vegetables, and hope. They were seasoned, rich, and warm, and they smelled like comfort, a scent peasants barely recognized. There were sweet treats, honey cakes, fruit tarts, and puddings made with ingredients so luxurious they bordered on sinful. Even the ale was stronger. Not weak breakfast ale, but celebration ale, the kind with enough alcohol to convince a grown man to dance in public. Which peasants absolutely did badly, but joyfully. Feasts were more than meals, they were social explosions. Singing, dancing, laughing, arguing, hugging, accidentally punching someone during a folk dance. All the wholesome medieval chaos you can imagine. For one day, peasants weren't crushed by work or hunger. They were part of something lively, communal, and warm. Children ran around with sticky fingers and sugar-high enthusiasm. Old villagers told embarrassing stories that probably weren't true. Even the livestock looked confused as to why everyone was smiling. But, like all good things in peasant life, feasts ended, the music faded, the fires dimmed. The leftover food disappeared faster than hope in February, and the next day, everyone went back to pottage. Still, for one glorious night, peasants tasted the life they never got to live. Preserving food in the Middle Ages wasn't a culinary skill. It was a desperate annual negotiation with death. Every autumn, peasants looked at their harvest, looked at the sky, and thought, well, let's see how much of this survives past January without turning into a biological experiment. That's where the Holy Trinity came in. Salt, smoke, and the kind of prayer normally reserved for last rites. Salt was the MVP of survival. If you had enough, you could preserve meat, fish, vegetables, and possibly even your sanity. Unfortunately, salt was expensive, so peasants used it like modern people use printer ink, sparingly, reluctantly, and while muttering curses. When they did salt meat, they didn't just season it, they entombed it. The meat looked less like dinner and more like a corpse prepared for a royal funeral. Months later, when you dug it out, you hoped the salt had worked and not simply preserved the smell of failure. Smoking was the second great option. Hang the meat above the hearth. Let it bathe in smoke for days until it turns into something between jerky and medieval plywood. It lasted forever, mostly because even bacteria refused to get involved. The flavor. Imagine licking a chimney while chewing on a belt. But it didn't kill you, which was the general standard for medieval cuisine. Drying food was another strategy. Apples, beans, peas, anything that didn't sprint away was sliced, spread out, and left to shrivel in the sun. Sure, bugs got into it sometimes, but peasants didn't panic about bugs. Bugs were simply extra texture or bonus meat. If it moved, you flicked it. If it didn't move, you pretended it never had. Of course, despite your best attempts, some food just mutated. Barrels swelled ominously, jars hissed, and stale bread developed fur thick enough to survive winter on its own. That's when peasants turned to the final method of preservation: prayer mixed with denial. If the food smelled weird, you prayed. If it looked weird, you prayed harder. If it growled, You gave it to the pigs and considered it divine intervention. In the end, medieval food preservation was never about taste. It was about staying alive with dignity hanging by a thread. If your winter meals tasted like salted smoke and existential dread, congratulations, you preserved them correctly. By evening, you're starving again. Not peckish, not I could nibble something, but the kind of hollow medieval starvation where your stomach begins narrating its own tragic backstory. The day's work is done. Your limbs feel like you borrowed them from a scarecrow, and now it's time for the most emotionally fragile meal of the day, the evening snack, a culinary event held together by hope, crumbs, and lowered expectations. If you're lucky, and by lucky I mean blessed by at least 3 minor saints, you get a chunk of yesterday's bread. Not soft bread, not warm bread, but the kind of stale bread that could break into your house at night and rob you. This bread doesn't bend, it threatens. You don't chew it so much as negotiate with it, slowly wearing it down like a river eroding stone. By the end, your jaw is filing a complaint with your skeleton. Sometimes, instead of bread, you get a roasted onion. Yes, an onion. A whole onion, eaten proudly, publicly, and without shame. Medieval peasants didn't consider it weird. They considered it dinner theater. You'd bite into that caramelized bulb and pretend it was sweet, when in reality, it tasted like poverty with a slightly warmer aftertaste. If the day was especially generous, you might get a cup of ale. Not because you're celebrating anything, but because medieval life required emotional cushioning. The ale is weak, but it takes the edge off your hunger, just enough that your body stops threatening to cannibalize itself. Children drink it too, because water is basically medieval roulette, and no one wants to raise their kids on diseases they can't pronounce. On rare evenings, you get cold pottage, not warm pottage, not fresh pottage. Cold, gelatinous, morally questionable pottage that jiggles in a way food probably shouldn't. You stare at it, it stares back. You eat it anyway, it stares. And sometimes you get nothing, just vibes and disappointment. You lie down hoping tomorrow magically produces more calories. Maybe a rabbit will wander by. Maybe a neighbor will trade you an egg. Maybe the cabbage in your garden will grow to millimeters overnight. Medieval hope was very specific. But regardless of what you manage to eat, the goal is simple. Consume something so that you can fall asleep with at least a whisper of energy for tomorrow's identical suffering. By the time night settles over the village, everything hurts. Your feet hurt, your back hurts, your pride hurts. Even your hunger has developed its own personality and is now pacing angrily inside your ribcage. But before surrendering to unconsciousness, there's one final ritual every medieval peasant must perform: the late-night ale of survival. This ale isn't fancy, it isn't refreshing, it isn't cold, it isn't even particularly good, but it exists. And in medieval Europe, that alone makes it a blessing. You hold the cup like it's medicine, salvation, and emotional support. Al-Anon. You take a sip. It tastes faintly of barley, smoke, and whatever the cup was washed with, if it was washed at all. But immediately, a warm numbness spreads through your body. Your stomach, which has been filing noise complaints all day, finally quiets. Your muscles unclench. For a brief moment, you remember what peace feels like. This is when the regret creeps in. Not existential regret, just the simple medieval kind. Regret that tomorrow is the same thing all over again. You think of tomorrow's pottage, tomorrow's bread brick, tomorrow's onion, tomorrow's endless labor. Then you take another sip of ale until you don't think very much at all. Once the ale has done its job and softened the sharp corners of reality, it's time for bed, or the medieval approximation of a bed. You collapse onto a straw mattress that crunches like autumn leaves and smells faintly of livestock, smoke, and choices you didn't make. The straw pokes you in places you didn't know had nerve endings, but you're too tired to care. You shift around until the pokiest part of the mattress stabs you somewhere you can live with. Your blanket is a coarse wool sheet that feels like it was designed by someone who hated skin. It's itchy, heavy, and probably hosting a thriving ecosystem of insects. Still, it's warm, and warmth is a luxury. You curl up under it, listening to the quiet sounds of the village, distant snoring, clucking chickens, a dog barking at a ghost only it can see. Your stomach growls. You ignore it. Tomorrow you'll eat again. Not much, not well, but enough. You close your eyes. The ale pulls you under. The regret dissolves. And with a final sigh, you whisper the medieval bedtime mantra. Please let tomorrow's pottage taste less like sadness, and then sleep. Marco Polo never explicitly wrote, "I entered the Great Khan's harem," because doing so would have meant instant disappearance into some remote Mongol steppe ditch. But in his notes, those strange, half-coded passages he claimed were just observations. There are cracks wide enough to glimpse a hidden world, a world he shouldn't have been anywhere near, a world reserved for silk-veiled women, eunuchs with perfect memory, and the emperor's most jealously guarded mysteries. And yet, Marco describes details no ordinary court visitor could possibly have known unless he ventured far closer than protocol allowed. He mentions chambers arranged in flower-like order, a phrase that seems poetic until you compare it with Yuan architectural custom, circular suites radiating from a central pavilion, each one assigned to a different rank of concubine. He writes of women who change garments by the seasons, noting fabrics that only palace residents could wear, light Uyghur silks for spring, heavy quilted brocades for winter, and scented cotton robes reserved for the emperor's favored companions. How would a foreign merchant know this unless someone let him see it? But the strangest hint comes in his descriptions of scent. Marco writes of fragrances layered like music, a distinctly intimate detail. The Mongol harem used a strict perfume hierarchy. High-ranking companions wore musk and ambery. Lesser concubines were restricted to iris water or rose. Servants were forbidden perfume altogether. These rules weren't public court gossip. They were internal regulations known only to the people who lived behind the silk curtains. Marco shouldn't have known any of this, and yet he writes about it as casually as he describes the price of paper in the marketplace. His tone, too, gives him away. In his travel diary, he is usually a merchant cataloging curiosities, but here his writing shifts, becoming almost cautious, tender, observational in a way that implies proximity. He speaks of eyes that watch even when lowered, of voices trained to calm storms, of rooms where the emperor is never alone, yet no one dares to speak. These aren't the words of someone repeating rumors. They're the words of someone who stood close enough to feel the room breathe. And so the first mystery of Marco Polo's secret notes is simple. If he truly never entered the harem, why does he write like a man who saw its shadows flicker just inches from his face? If Marco's first hints reveal proximity, his second set of notes exposes something even bolder, a clear understanding of the harem's internal hierarchy, its tiers, privileges, punishments, and the invisible ladder every concubine feared or fought to climb. Official Chinese court records describe it in stiff, bureaucratic language, but Marco's descriptions breathe. They feel lived, they feel witnessed. He writes of those closest to the Khan, who walk as if the floor itself bends beneath them, referring to the 4 senior consorts, the highest-ranking women in the entire palace. They held authority second only to the empress, and were effectively political officers. Beneath them, Marco hints at the ladies who wait in twilight, likely describing the Zhaoyi and Zhaorang, middle-ranking favorites who could catch the emperor's eye for months, all be forgotten in a single dawn. And then there were the flowers of the outer garden, his poetic name for the lowest-ranking concubines, girls taken from conquered kingdoms, tribute offerings, or daughters of powerful families hoping to buy imperial favor. Their lives were a mixture of luxury and dread. They lived in silk, but moved in fear. One misstep, one wrong glance, one whisper, overheard by the wrong servant, could end their ascent before it began. Marco even implies the existence of informal ranks, the unwritten laws of the harem. These were not decreed by the emperor, but by the women themselves. Senior concubines controlled perfume allotments, chose which dancers performed at festivals, and most terrifyingly determined who was fit to serve the Kayan personally. A woman denied by them didn't rise, ever. He also notes the strange economics of affection in the UN world. High-ranking concubines received bolts of gold-threaded silk and jars of rare Tibetan musk. Others were given lesser gifts: hairpins, fans, small mirrors, tokens meant to maintain order more than affection. The emperor's attention was currency, and every woman lived in a kind of emotional stock market where fortunes rose and collapsed overnight. Marco's most daring line reads, "Even silence has rank among them." Only a man who had seen the harem in motion, its whispers, glances, rituals, would phrase it like that. Whether he stepped through those guarded doors, or merely got close enough to hear what others missed, his notes leave no doubt. The harem was not just a place, it was a theater of power where desire was structured, regulated, and weaponized with precision. Among Marco Polo's strangest and most revealing observations are his notes on scent. Not clothing, not jewels, not gestures. Perfume in the Yuan imperial court wasn't simply a luxury. It was a language, a ranking system, and a weapon. And Marco describes it with the precision of someone who had breathed it in himself. He writes that a woman's presence may be known before her foot crosses the threshold, an unmistakable reference to the perfumed hierarchy that regulated who wore what. High-ranking consorts were permitted heavy, lingering fragrances that announced their approach: Tibetan musk, ambergris, imported from the Indian Ocean, and the precious resin known as dragon's brain, which only the emperor's favorites were allowed to use. These scents were strong, layered, and unmistakable. They didn't just enter a room, they conquered it, Marco continues. Some smell of spring, others of dawn after rain. This is his coded way of describing the middle ranks who were limited to lighter perfumes: iris, water, osmanthus oil, touches of clove, or sweet flag. These scents whispered rather than shouted, marking their wearers as desirable but not dominant. Marco's descriptions show he understood these subtleties perfectly. But the most telling detail comes from his notes on the lowest ranks. He writes, "Many wear no scent at all. For to carry fragrance without right is to borrow a crown without permission." This was indeed an unbreakable rule. The lowest-ranking women were forbidden strong perfumes. Their bodies were washed in unscented rice water. Their clothing smelled only of the cedarwood chests in which they were stored. To wear a scent above one's rank was a punishable offense, one that implied ambition, deceit, or seduction out of turn. Even more fascinating is Marco's mention of seasonal scents, noting the warming odor of winter and the cooling aromas of summer. This reflects the harem's elaborate seasonal rotation. Warming fragrances like cinnamon and musk in cold months, cooling ones like sandalwood and lotus when the palace sweltered. Every scent had a function, every aroma had a meaning. And then, almost carelessly, Marco adds, "Some scents cling to the skin long after the woman has gone." That is not something a man writes when he learns these rules from a distance. His notes don't simply describe perfume, they betray proximity. Too much proximity for a mere traveler. If perfumes revealed rank, the tests of loyalty revealed something far more precious: survival. Marco Polo's notes grow strangely cautious when he describes these rituals as if writing them down might offend someone powerful, yet he still records them, encoded in metaphor, softened with poetic language, but clear enough to reconstruct the hidden machinery of the harem. He writes that the Kayan trusts no heart that has not first been weighed, a statement that seems vague until you realize the UN harem used multi-stage loyalty assessments to separate the obedient from the ambitious. The first test was obedience in silence. Marco describes gatherings where women wait like still water, making no ripple unless stirred. This was literal. The emperor's attendants would observe how long a woman could remain motionless, voicing no complaint and showing no impatience. A concubine who fidgeted, sighed, or reacted was considered unreliable. Next came the test of truth, conducted not by the emperor, but by senior concubines and eunuchs. Marco hints at eyes that can read the spine of a lie before the mouth forms it, a poetic way of describing interrogations disguised as casual conversation. These elder women were trained to detect ambition, resentment, or hidden loyalties, especially lingering attachment to a girl's family or tribe. One careless remark, and a concubine might find herself reassigned, demoted, or quietly removed from consideration. Then came the most feared ritual, the test of devotion. Marco calls it a night where the moon sees more than the candles, suggesting a ceremony where personal behavior was evaluated with almost spiritual seriousness. The chosen concubines were observed by attendants as they prepared for potential summons, how they dressed, how they helped one another, how they spoke when they believed no authority listened. A woman who displayed envy, vanity, or cruelty failed instantly. The emperor wanted loyalty, not intrigue. Marco's most unsettling note refers to the test no one speaks of except in glances. Scholars believe he meant the loyalty of the body, ensuring a concubine had no lovers, no secret attachments, no risk of bearing a child not fathered by the KHN medical examinations. Supervised washing, even controlled movement within palace walls, ensured absolute exclusivity. These rituals weren't merely tests, they were filters, refining a harem of hundreds into a trusted inner circle. Marco writes about them with the tone of someone who did not merely hear rumors, but sensed the anxiety in the air, the tension behind every elegant gesture. No outsider describes fear this precisely, unless he has walked beside it. If the concubines were the hidden stars of the harem, the anoks were its gravity, quiet, constant, unseen, but inescapable. Marco Polo's notes suddenly sharpen when he speaks of them, as if even he understood that these men, half servants, half spies, were the real enforcers of the emperor's private world. His descriptions are unusually careful, full of respect and subtle fear. He writes of men who move like shadows, yet carry the weight of the sun, a poetic but accurate summary of their paradoxical role. Eunuchs had no families, no heirs, no clans to protect. That made them, in the emperor's eyes, incorruptible. They lived entirely within the palace ecosystem, and therefore owed every breath to the throne. Marco knew this, and he hints that approaching the harem without their approval was impossible. Marco describes how the eunuchs memorized everything. Names, scents, footsteps, even the way each concubine lowered her eyes. They were trained to detect the smallest irregularities, and Polo writes of them, hearing what others only feel. They oversaw the baths, the dressing chambers, the night rotations, and the delivery of imperial summons. Any deviation, any unsanctioned movement, any hint of a private interaction, gone. The eunuchs would erase it before it left a trace. Most fascinating are Marco's notes on their ritual responsibilities. He mentions the keepers of purity, likely referring to eunuchs who supervised the concubines' living quarters. These men ensured no outsider could enter, and no woman could leave without authorization. Marco hints at secret passageways, corridors narrow enough for only one body to pass, used exclusively by them to appear and disappear at will. This matches Chinese court records describing labyrinthine service routes beneath and around palace women's chambers. He also reveals that eunuchs were responsible for the emperor's nightly selections. Before any concubine was summoned, eunuchs prepared her chamber, checked her attire, inspected her hair and perfume, and recorded the event in secret logs. Marco writes, "Nothing touches the emperor unless touched first by them." A foreign observer would have no access to this knowledge unless he stood close enough to watch a eunuch at work, or close enough to be watched by one. Yet Marco's most striking line is this: they speak softly, but each word can break a kingdom. Eunuchs controlled information, rumors, schedules, and access. A whisper from one of them could elevate a concubine or destroy her, and they knew it. Marco's precise insights are impossible unless he hovered near the heart of their operations. Too close for a simple merchant, far too close for comfort. In most courts, an emperor's private nights were hidden behind walls of rumor. But in the Yuan palace, these nights were choreographed, like a ceremony, half ritual, half surveillance. And Marco Polo's notes describe them with a precision that borders on the forbidden. He calls them the hours when the palace breathes differently, implying he witnessed preparations firsthand, or, at the very least, stood close enough to hear what outsiders never should. He explains that the emperor never chose a concubine on the spot. The decision was made hours earlier by an intricate machine of eunuchs, attendants, and senior consorts. Marco writes that the emperor's desire is a river guided by many hands, hinting that politics, alliances, and harem hierarchies shaped the nightly summons just as much as the emperor's mood. The ritual began with purification. Marco describes concubines bathing in warm water infused with lotus and silkwood, their skin dried with cloths scented lightly so as not to overpower the emperor. Their hair was braided in specific patterns, simple for lower ranks, elaborate for favorites, with jade pins reserved solely for the highest consorts. A single misplaced pin could signal jealousy or ambition. Marco's awareness of these subtleties suggests proximity. No translator would bother to pass. He also notes the emperor's insistence on calmness. Before a concubine was brought forward, a trembling lip, a nervous blink, even a heartbeat too fast, could lead to dismissal. Marco writes of faces painted not with color, but with discipline, a sharp and accurate description of the mental stillness demanded of any woman entering the emperor's presence. The journey itself was ceremonial. The concubine was carried, not allowed to walk, wrapped in a quilted blanket to symbolize purity and prevent her feet from touching the ground. Only eunuchs could lift her, and even then they kept their eyes lowered. Marco notes this with fascination. She moves like a secret being transported, not a woman walking. This detail appears in Chinese records, but for a European traveler to include, it shows he heard or saw the practice more directly than expected. Finally, Marco reveals the most intimate rule. The concubine once chosen could not speak unless addressed. Silence was not submission. It was protocol. The emperor was to feel that desire moved toward him effortlessly, without plea or performance. Marco's ability to recount these details suggests he lingered far closer to the emperor's shadowed rituals than any outsider had a right to. If Marco Polo's earlier notes describe order, this chapter reveals the chaos beneath it. The rivalries, jealousies, and subtle wars fought between concubines who lived closer to power than ministers, yet further from freedom than prisoners. Marco writes of the harem as a garden, where flowers compete for the same sun, a deceptively gentle metaphor for a system where beauty was currency, favor was oxygen, and neglect was a slow death. According to him, the fiercest tensions were not between high and low ranks, but within adjacent ranks, where ambition was close enough to taste. A Jowie and a Yang might share attendants, corridors, music tutors, and the same fear that one evening selection could elevate one woman and freeze the other in place forever. Marco notes that their smiles were wide enough to hide teeth, implying politeness was often a mask for rivalry sharp enough to wound. He describes three primary battlegrounds: appearance, influence, and rumor. In appearance, Marco notes they sculpt their silence as carefully as their hair, meaning discipline mattered more than beauty. A perfectly controlled gaze could signal confidence. A flicker of envy could invite scrutiny. Women learned to weaponize grace, to move softly enough to seem harmless, yet visible enough to remind the emperor and everyone else that they still existed. Influence was subtler. Senior concubines controlled music teachers, embroidery supplies, dance rehearsals, even perfume access. A single withheld resource could sabotage a rival's preparation for an imperial summon. Marco hints that some women fed rivals bad advice. Some whisper guidance that leads only to shadows, a clear reference to sabotage, cloaked as sisterly concern. But the deadliest battlefield, Marco writes, was rumor. Words could wound where hands could not. A suggestion that a rival was too ambitious, too emotional, or too attached to her old clan could doom her quietly. The emperor never heard the rumors directly. Eunuchs and senior consorts carried them upward like smoke. Marco, listening from somewhere he shouldn't have been, writes that no lie travels faster than one spoken softly. And yet he adds a final, almost tragic insight. Even enemies braid each other's hair. The harem forced intimacy. Rivals shared rooms, meals, tutors, and rituals. They sang together in the evenings, practiced dances in synchrony, knelt side by side during ceremonies. Their hatred had to be soft enough to hide under silk. Marco captures this paradox perfectly. Women bound together yet set against each other, competing for the affection of a single man who would outlive most of them. If rivalry was the daily tension of the harem, rumor was its deadliest weapon. Marco Polo's notes become strangely sharp here, as if he wanted to record this part with more precision, either because he witnessed the effects himself, or because someone inside the palace whispered the truth directly into his ear. He writes, "In this place, a word weighs more than a sword." And in the Yuan harem, that was no metaphor. Rumors did not float aimlessly. They were launched like arrows. A concubine who wanted to weaken a rival rarely acted herself. She planted a seed with a eunuch, a lady in waiting, or a musician who drifted between quarters. Marco notes that these messengers carry songs, stories, and secrets, moving information as effortlessly as air circulates through a room. What made rumor terrifying was its plausible deniability. No one ever knew where it began, only where it ended. The deadliest accusation one could suffer was disloyalty, not to the emperor, but to the harem order. A whisper that a woman had spoken against another consort, or resented a gift or cried after a dismissal, could be interpreted as instability. Marco writes that even sorrow is dangerous if seen by the wrong eyes. If a rival spread such a rumor, eunuchs would watch the woman more closely. A senior concubine might limit her perfume outment, or restrict her attendance. Small punishments that created an impression of guilt. Another lethal rumor involved outside attachment, that a woman still longed for a man from her home region, or that she kept a hidden token from her past. Marco describes this with surprising empathy, noting that memory is not a crime, but it can be made into one. Such accusations, even if false, could remove a concubine from the emperor's rotation indefinitely. Yet, the most insidious rumor was the one Marco calls the shadow without a source. A suggestion that a woman was unlucky, not immoral, not rebellious, simply unfortunate. A concubine who wasn't chosen for a season might be labeled cold in spirit. A minor illness could be reframed as spiritual contamination. Once this idea took hold, no one wanted to be seen with her. Misfortune was contagious. Marco's notes reveal that many women feared these whispered fates more than death itself, because death ended suffering. Rumors prolonged it. A woman destroyed by rumor did not vanish. She faded, slowly, painfully, invisibly. And Marco ends the chapter with an unsettling line. In a palace of 1,000 lamps, the darkest rooms are made of words. Marco Polo ends his hints about the harem with passages so half-veiled that scholars still argue whether they are metaphor, memory, or confession. But read closely, and one thing becomes clear. These were not casual travel observations. They were forbidden notes written by a man who saw more than he was ever meant to. He admits that certain halls of the palace were guarded not by walls, but by silence. A striking comment that suggests he learned of these places not from officials, but from whispers traded in the shadows. Marco speaks of doors that open only when the moon climbs high, describing nighttime movements within the palace, movements he had no formal right to witness. His curiosity was dangerous, but something or someone kept feeding it. The most tantalizing line appears almost casually. "I once saw a lantern light where no lantern should be." What was he doing in a restricted corridor at night? Why did a concubine's chambers appear in his notes with such descriptive clarity? These questions have haunted historians for centuries. Marco also writes about secrets the women entrusted to no man, yet he lists details of their routines, perfumes, rivalries, and terrors with disarming accuracy. Either he was a quick student of gossip, or he had a source inside those forbidden walls. His wording hints at the latter. He describes a voice soft as folded silk that told stories the palace itself had forgotten. A woman, a servant, a eunuch, who found him amusing. Every possibility is dangerous. Then comes the most shocking implication. A single glance taught me more than a week of listening. Glances require proximity. They require sightlines. They require presence. Marco's descriptions of forbidden architecture, curved doorframes, embroidered screens depicting lovers separated by rivers, corridors, lined with perfumed cloth, match no public section of the palace. These belonged to women's quarters, shielded from diplomacy and foreign eyes. Yet he catalogues them with the precision of a man sketching from memory. Still, Marco never claims authority. He hides behind modesty, saying his knowledge comes only from reports gathered humbly. But the tone betrays him. Men who repeat rumors write loosely. Marco writes tightly with intimacy, with quiet wonder. His pen tip trembles, not with fear, but with awe. At the end of his notes, he stops abruptly, as if realizing that one more sentence might reveal too much. No more can be written, he says. Some truths belong only to shadows. And that is perhaps the greatest secret of all. Marco Polo may not have entered the harem, but the harem entered him. In medieval Baghdad, sunset was not an ending, it was an opening act. As the last streaks of gold sank behind the Tigris, the city seemed to inhale deeply, as though preparing for a second secret life. The daytime world of scholars, scribes, ministers, and court officials faded into the background, replaced by something looser, livelier, and infinitely more human. Baghdad by night felt like a different city entirely, illuminated not by the authority of the caliphs, but by the warm glow of oil lamps and moonlight. The heat of the day, often thick enough to slow thought itself, finally relented. A cooler breeze swept through narrow alleys and over the city's great bridges, carrying with it the first hints of spice, roasting meat, jasmine smoke, and river mist. Doors creaked open, merchants rolled down woven mats, lantern sellers, always the first to appear, lit their globes one by one until the markets shimmered like constellations fallen to earth. What daylight could not hide, darkness illuminated. Families stepped outside after hours of sheltering from the sun. Young men wandered toward the busiest squares, chasing music and laughter. Women visited vendors who only operated at night, their stalls specializing in perfumes, cloth, dyes, and cosmetics. Forbidden to sell during the day, the city's edges blurred with activity. The rich, the poor, the foreign, the local, all found themselves drifting along the same streets, woven into the same fabric by the anonymity of darkness. Above the noise, you could hear the night callers, fruit sellers, chanting prices in melodic cadences, sweetmakers tapping trays to lure customers, storytellers warming up their voices like musicians tuning instruments. Baghdad's night markets were not merely commercial spaces, they were theatrical. Every sound had rhythm. Every corner promised new sights. Even the shadows held stories. Travelers, arriving for the first time, often believed they had stumbled into a festival. But locals knew the truth. This was ordinary life. Baghdad's glory was not reserved for daylight. It blossomed after sundown. Scholars leaving the House of Wisdom drifted into the bazaars to continue debates over cups of mint tea. Poets rehearsed verses out loud as they walked. Sufi mystics, musicians, and artisans mingled with fishermen from the riverbanks and wealthy merchants returning from caravan routes. Night was not a pause in Baghdad. It was the hour when the city finally woke up. Before the night market could come alive, Baghdad needed light. And so, just after sundown, a quiet procession began. The lantern lighters. These men were as essential to the city's nocturnal life as merchants or musicians. And Marco Polo himself once wrote that Baghdad glowed as if the stars had rested upon its streets. He wasn't exaggerating. The lantern lighters moved through the bazaars with long poles tipped with small flames, touching each wick with deliberate grace. Watching them was like witnessing constellations being born. The first lamps hung from wooden beams and archways, casting warm halos across the stone pathways. Others dangled on chains, swaying gently in the evening breeze. But the real beauty came from the colored glass lanterns, ruby red, emerald green, and amber gold, made by local artisans who treated glasswork as both science and poetry. When lit, these lanterns transformed the alleyways into glowing rivers of stained light, turning even the most ordinary stall into a stage. Children followed the lantern lighters like they were magicians, giggling when the shadows danced on the walls. Older residents watched quietly, recognizing the ceremony not as a novelty, but as a promise. The market was open, the night had begun, and the city was now officially in its most enchanting form. By the time the last wick flickered to life, Baghdad's landscape had transformed. What had been warm clay, striped awnings, and dusty stone moments earlier was now a luminous maze filled with mystery. Lanterns illuminated hanging carpets, copper bowls, silk scarves, and pyramids of figs and dates. Even the river shimmered differently, reflecting hundreds of tiny flames as if answering them. Night guards took their positions, leaning on spears or curved sabers, but even they softened in the glow. The markets at night felt safer than many cities did by day. The caliphs invested heavily in nighttime security, believing that commerce under moonlight was a sign of a prosperous civilization. Merchants relied on this protection, setting out their most delicate goods after dark: jewelry, silverwork, fine ceramics, ink and paper, rare herbs, and sometimes even books copied by scholars only hours earlier. The lanterns didn't just make the market visible, they made it magical. In their glow, secrets felt possible, deals felt fated, and every passerby looked like a character from a story waiting to unfold. And as the first hour of night settled in, the real bustle began. If the lanterns gave Baghdad's night markets their glow, the spices gave them their soul. Long before one saw the stalls, one smelled them. The air turned into a fragrant tapestry woven from distant corners of the world, a scent map of the Silk Road itself. Many travelers later wrote that the first breath of the night market was intoxicating, a perfume so vivid it felt like stepping into another dimension. The moment you entered, the spices greeted you like old friends: cinnamon from Ceylon, pepper from India, saffron from Persia, frankincense from Arabia, and ginger carried over months-long caravan journeys. But there were also treasures known only to the Abbasid world: grains of paradise, long pepper, sumac, bright as crushed rubies, and black cumin that healers swore could cure anything except death itself. Merchants arranged their spices with theatrical pride. Some built pyramids of golden turmeric that glowed under lantern light. Others blended powders into swirling patterns, as if the colors alone could seduce a buyer before a single word was spoken. The most ambitious sellers burned a pinch of their best spice blend over charcoal braziers, letting the fragrance drift like a silent salesman through the crowd. Spice dealers were storytellers as much as merchants. They didn't just sell ingredients, they sold worlds. A man crushing cloves in a mortar might tell you about storms off the coast of Gujarat. A seller tying bundles of cinnamon sticks could whisper legends of the phoenix said to nest in cinnamon groves. And the more expensive the spice, the more elaborate the story. A narrative economy as powerful as coin. Food vendors nearby depended on these merchants, like actors depend on lighting. They simmered lamb kebabs, dusted with cumin, ladled out lentil stews rich with coriander, and fried dough coated in sesame and honey. Even the simplest street foods took on extraordinary personality thanks to the spice economy. Travelers often confessed that they spent more coins on snacks than souvenirs. But spices served another purpose. They formed a kind of social map. Follow the smoky scent of cardamom, and you'd find tea houses. Track the sweet perfume of anise, and you'd find poets reciting under canopies. Wander toward musk and sandalwood, and you'd stumble into perfume sellers and apothecaries mixing remedies by lamplight. In the night markets of Baghdad, spices didn't just flavor food, they guided you enchanted you, and invited you deeper into the city's nocturnal heart. By the time the lanterns were blazing and the spices perfumed the air, the night markets of medieval Baghdad became a crossroads where half the world seemed to gather. If daytime commerce belonged to officials and guildmasters, nighttime belonged to travelers, nomads, sailors, scholars, fortune-seekers, and merchants from horizons so distant they sounded mythical to the average Baghdadi. Baghdad's location, along the Tigris, at the center of caravan routes linking India, China, Africa, Persia, Anatolia, and the Mediterranean made it the commercial heartbeat of the Islamic Golden Age. At night, that heartbeat was loudest. Lanterns lit not just local vendors, but men and women who had traveled for months, sometimes years, to reach the Abbasid capital. A silk merchant from Khorasan unfolded shimmering bolts of cloth that looked like woven moonlight, each as soft as breath. Next to him, a Yemen incense trader displayed frankincense nuggets the size of walnuts, their sweet smoke curling upward like prayers made visible. Indian ship captains, still smelling faintly of sea salt, arrived with pepper, coconuts, and rare woods carved into delicate figurines. African merchants from the Swahili coast brought ivory combs, gold dust, and intricately dyed cloth with geometric patterns bold enough to catch any eye passing by. But it wasn't only products that traveled, it was stories. A Persian astronomer would debate star charts with an Andalusian scholar who claimed the skies looked different above Cordoba. A Berber caravan leader might recount crossing the Sahara, describing dunes as tall as palaces. Chinese envoys brought lacquer so smooth it reflected lantern light like water. And if one was lucky, they told of distant cities where fireworks lit the sky brighter than Baghdad's lamps. These people didn't merely browse or trade, they mingled, forming a human river flowing through the winding alleys. You could hear 5 languages in a single minute: Arabic, Persian, Greek, Turkic, Swahili, sometimes even Chinese. Foreigners often said no city in the world felt as alive, as layered, or as welcoming at night, and Baghdad embraced them. The night market was an equalizer. No one cared about your rank or homeland under the soft glow of lanterns. A fisherman from the Tigris could stand shoulder to shoulder with a merchant who owned caravans stretching from Damascus to Samak. Trade forged friendships, stories forged bonds, deals forged futures, and as the night deepened, the crowd only grew larger. Because in Baghdad, darkness didn't silence the world, it gathered it. If merchants supplied the goods, artists supplied the soul of Baghdad's night markets. As the darkness thickened and lanterns glowed brighter, poets, musicians, storytellers, and wandering performers spilled into the squares like sparks from a fire. In medieval Baghdad, art wasn't confined to palaces or scholarly halls. It belonged to the streets, and nowhere did it shine more brilliantly than under the oil lamps of the night bazaar. The poets were often the first to draw crowds. They stood on raised carpets or overturned crates, reciting verses that flowed like silk, sometimes romantic, sometimes mystical, sometimes hilariously mocking corrupt officials or boastful merchants. Their words carried the perfume of Arabic literature, shaped by the traditions of al-Mutanabi, Abu Enuwas, and hundreds of lesser-known talents who lit up the night for a few copper coins. Lovers drifted close, pretending to shop, while secretly listening for lines that echoed their own hearts. Nearby, musicians plucked at, struck tambourines, and played flutes so soft they seemed to weave themselves into the night breeze. The melodies shifted with the crowd, slow and smoky when the evening was young, vibrant and fast when the market swelled, then warm and nostalgic after midnight when only the devoted remained. A single oud player could gather 50 people without calling out a word. The music itself was an invitation. Then came the storytellers, the hakawatis, who commanded the loudest circles. Children sat wide-eyed at their feet, while adults lingered at the edges, pretending they weren't just as captivated. The stories blended myth, history, and outright fantasy. One moment, the crowd traveled through the deserts with Sinbad. The next, they were meeting jinn in abandoned ruins, or watching kaifs disguise themselves to walk among the poor. These tales were not fixed. Each storyteller added, subtracted, embellished. Baghdad's night didn't just preserve legends, it reinvented them. Sufi mystics wandered between performers, chanting verses of divine love that drifted like smoke between the stalls. Sometimes they stopped to whirl in short meditative dances, their movements casting spinning shadows across the market floor. Philosophers from the House of Wisdom occasionally joined these circles, turning the market into an impromptu academy where debates on ethics or astronomy unfolded, next to melon sellers and spice merchants. In Baghdad, the night market was a living theater. No curtain, no stage, just people, voices, instruments, and a city that believed art belonged to everyone. In most medieval cities, night meant rest. But in Baghdad, capital of the Abbasid Caliphate and cradle of the Islamic Golden Age, night meant study. And nowhere was this more visible than in the bookstores that glittered like treasure chests along the night market's busiest lanes. Under rows of oil lamps, you could find scholars, scribes, translators, and curious wanderers gathered around piles of manuscripts, as if they were examining jewels. Books were Baghdad's greatest luxury, but also its greatest addiction. The House of Wisdom, the empire's intellectual crown, stayed active long after sundown. Scholars often left its halls buzzing with ideas and wandered straight into the night markets, eager to argue, research, or buy freshly copied volumes before returning to their own late-night work. And so the bookstores became an extension of the great library, a public annex where debate and education were as common as commerce. Booksellers treated their craft like performance. They stacked volumes of poetry, philosophy, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and translated Greek texts with exaggerated precision, letting the spines catch the lantern light. A good bookseller didn't simply sell a manuscript. He recommended readings, recited favorite lines, compared authors, and could match a buyer with the perfect text as if prescribing medicine. One stall might offer a translation of Aristotle that had passed through 3 languages, Greek to Syriac, Syriac to Arabic, each layer adding new interpretation. Another might display a fresh copy of Al-Khwarizmi's work on algebra still smelling of ink. A third would feature poetry collections, Rumi, Al-Mutanabi, or sometimes a young local poet hoping to be discovered. Travelers said that even if you entered with no intention to buy a book, you left with at least 2. But the real magic was the scholars who browsed. There they were impossible to miss. Their eyes are light, their fingers tracing calligraphy, their voices rising excitedly whenever a debate began. One mathematician might argue with a physician about the nature of infinity. A historian might interrupt with a comment about ancient Persia. A teenage student could jump in and astonish everyone with a perfectly memorized verse. The night market was a university without walls, and the atmosphere was contagious. Even ordinary citizens felt pulled into conversations drawn by the scholars' enthusiasm. People stayed not because they understood everything, but because Baghdad made learning feel like a celebration, a communal act as natural as breathing. Under the lanterns, surrounded by ink and parchment, Baghdad felt like a city that refused to let the mind sleep. If the lanterns lit the markets, and the poets gave them voice, then the food vendors gave Baghdad its heartbeat. The night market was a feast long before it was a marketplace. Long after the day's formal meals had ended, the true flavors of the city emerged. Smoky, spicy, sweet, sizzling, irresistible. Every corner seemed to hum with fire and fragrance. Follow the scent of charcoal, and you'd find grilled lamb kebabs sputtering over open flames, seasoned with cumin and coriander until the air itself tasted warm. Beside them, cooks chopped onions and parsley with rhythmic thumps that blended into the market's music, drizzled with lemon and wrapped in warm bread. These kebabs were the unofficial evening meal of Baghdad, cheap enough for a laborer, delicious enough for a scholar. Next came the stew sellers, stirring enormous copper pots filled with lentils, chickpeas, and slow-cooked meats. Their steam clouds rose into the lantern light like glowing spirits. Customers lined up with clay bowls, eager to taste a broth seasoned with cinnamon, pepper, and garlic. Some vendors added dried limes for a sour, irresistible twist, a flavor signature of Iraqi cuisine that made travelers pause mid-bite, eyes widening in surprise. Sweetmakers were the market's crown. Tables overflowed with dates, stuffed with almonds, sesame-coated pastries, fried dough drenched in honey, and rosewater sweets so fragrant they competed with the perfume sellers. The sound of syrup dripping onto hot pastries made passers-by stop out of instinct. It was dessert theater. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves. Adults pretended to buy just one, then returned minutes later for 3 more. But the true centerpiece of the night market was the tea vendors. Their kettles hissed like serpents as they poured dark, strong tea brewed with cardamom. The cups were tiny, but the flavor was immense. People didn't drink tea to refresh themselves. They drank to stay awake, to talk, to debate, to linger just a little longer under the lamps. A single pot could fuel an hour-long discussion about poetry, politics, astronomy, or gossip. Other treats dotted the alleys: roasted chickpeas crackling in iron pans, melon slices chilled in river-cooled basins, saffron rice cakes wrapped in banana leaves, yogurt drinks poured over crushed mint leaves, and everywhere, always, food was shared. Strangers offered bites to strangers. Vendors slipped extra pieces to children. A scholar and a fisherman could sit side by side on a bench, elbows touching, both licking honey from their fingers. Because, in Baghdad, the night didn't just feed the stomach, it nourished the city's soul. Beyond the bright stalls and crowded squares, the night markets of medieval Baghdad had another layer, deeper, quieter, almost secretive. If the lantern-lit bazaars were the city's face, these hidden corners were its pulse. Here, under the dimmer glow of smaller lamps, healers, mystics, fortune-tellers, and apothecaries carried out work that blended medicine, superstition, and ancient tradition. The healers were impossible to miss. They sat behind baskets of herbs that smelled of earth and memory: dried mint, lavender, myrrh, resin, fennel seeds, bitter almonds, and strange roots brought by caravans from the Zagros Mountains. Their tools were simple: mortar, pestles, copper bowls, but their reputations were complex. Some were trained in scientific remedies from the hospitals of Baghdad, where medicine was advancing faster than anywhere in the world. Others relied on folk wisdom passed down for generations. Most were a blend of both. They mixed tinctures to ease stomach troubles, pastes for wounds, teas for sleeplessness, and powders to calm tempers. Some healers whispered Quranic verses as they worked. Others recited Greek medical theories like they were poetry. And yet, most customers didn't care about the method, only the relief. A few steps away, the fortune-tellers sat behind carpets decorated with symbols, talismans, and cracked bowls used for scrying. They read palms, cast shells, interpreted dreams, and predicted journeys. Some were old women with piercing eyes. Others were young men with silver tongues and pockets full of charms. People approached them cautiously, half believing, half doubting, but always curious. Baghdad was a city of knowledge, but also one that left room for mystery. Even a scholar might secretly ask whether a journey would be safe or a marriage prosperous. The apothecaries were somewhere between healer and magician. Their shelves overflowed with jars of colored powders, oils, perfumes, dried insects, and curious stones pulled from riverbeds. They sold ingredients for remedies, yes, but also for love potions, protective amulets, and rituals meant to chase away the evil eye. Their clientele ranged from anxious merchants to confident poets seeking inspiration. These corners of the market had a different sound from the bustling center. Here, voices dropped to whispers. Lanterns flickered instead of shining bright. People moved slowly, not out of laziness, but reverence. Every remedy, omen, and charm carried weight. And in these quiet pockets, under dim light and drifting incense, Baghdad revealed a softer truth. Knowledge could heal bodies, mystery could soothe hearts, and the night had room for both. No matter how alive the night felt, dawn always approached with quiet certainty. And in the night markets of medieval Baghdad, the final hour before sunrise was its own kind of enchantment, softer, slower, almost melancholic. The lanterns still glowed, but their light weakened as the sky lightened. The oil inside them thinned, their flames shrank. It was as if the city itself exhaled, tired yet satisfied. After a night of storytelling, trading, singing, and feasting, vendors began their gentle ritual of closing. Spice sellers covered their pyramids of color with linen cloths. Sweet makers poured the last streaks of honey from their copper pans, letting it cool into amber threads. Tea vendors emptied kettles, their hissing fading like the final notes of a long performance. Perfume sellers seeked bottles of rosewater and musk, careful not to spill a drop. Scent was too precious to waste, even at dawn. The poets' voices softened. The musicians set down their instruments. Even the storytellers, who could talk for hours without tiring, paused mid-tale and promised to continue. Tomorrow night. By this time, the crowd had thinned. Scholars drifted home with ink-stained fingers and new books tucked under their arms. Travelers slipped away to roadside inns. Families gathered the last treats for breakfast. Street cats claimed leftover scraps with triumphant meows. The market felt less like a festival and more like a memory folding itself neatly away. The river was the first to reflect morning. The Tigris shimmered pale silver, and the reflection of lanterns blurred into soft streaks before disappearing entirely. Fishermen appeared with their nets, greeting the night vendors as if they belonged to opposite worlds, one ending, one beginning. The scent of bread baking in nearby ovens signaled that Baghdad's daytime life was stirring. But for those who experienced it fully, the transition felt bittersweet. The night markets were Baghdad at its most alive. A place where merchants, mystics, scholars, artists, sailors, and wanderers shared the same streets without hesitation or hierarchy. By day, the city was brilliant. By night, it was intimate. When the oil lamps finally dimmed, it felt like waking from a dream you desperately wanted to remember. As the sun crested above the city's rooftops, the last vendors walked home carrying empty baskets but full hearts. They knew that once the heat faded and the shadows lengthened, Baghdad would bloom all over again. The night did not die, it merely slept, because, in this golden age, the city's true pulse beat strongest under the stars. At 16, Julius Caesar discovered that childhood could evaporate in a single afternoon. His father died suddenly, not in battle, not in disgrace, but quietly, almost politely, leaving behind neither scandal nor explanation. Yet for Caesar, this calm departure triggered a storm that would reshape the rest of his life. In a republic obsessed with lineage and alliances, a father was not just a parent, he was a shield. And with that shield gone, Caesar stood exposed before the most dangerous forces in Rome. The first days after the death were filled with ritual, visitors, and whispered condolences. But beneath the mourning hung an unspoken anxiety. Caesar's family, the Iuli, were ancient, noble, and proud. But noble didn't mean powerful. They were respected, yes, but politically fragile. And in 85 BCE, Rome was not a city where fragility went unnoticed. Caesar watched as relatives measured their words, as household slaves moved nervously. As his mother, Aurelia, held the family together with the steel composure she became famous for. She understood the threat they faced. Rome was in the grip of Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a man whose smile meant nothing and whose anger meant exile, or worse. Sulla had already flooded the city with proscriptions, long lists of enemies marked for execution. The elite trembled, families hid their sons. Caesar, in the midst of grief, suddenly found himself a potential target. Why? Because of a marriage. Shortly before his father's death, Caesar had been betrothed to Cornelia, the daughter of Sas, one of Sulla's fiercest rivals. What had once been a politically advantageous match now painted a glowing red target on his teenage back. And Caesar, even as a boy, was sharp enough to sense it. His tutors later recalled that he became restless, watchful. He walked the family atrium with the seriousness of a man twice his age. He listened more than he spoke. He learned quickly which doors in Rome were safe to knock on, and which were suddenly fatal. Losing his father forced Caesar to step into adulthood before he had time to grow into it. It severed his protection, thrust him into political crossfire, and marked the moment when the world stopped treating him as a promising boy and began treating him as a potential threat. In grief, something else took root in him, ambition born from vulnerability, and soon enough, Rome would notice. When Caesar stepped into his 17th year, Rome was no longer the bustling, argumentative city he had grown up in. It had transformed into a place where people spoke in murmurs, where neighbors avoided eye contact, and where every footstep behind you felt like a warning. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, victorious from the civil wars, ruled the republic with icy ruthlessness. His prescriptions, hit lists carved into public boards, declared who was allowed to live and who would be hunted down like an animal. Heads were displayed in the forum as everyday reminders of obedience. This was the Rome of Caesar's adolescence, and Caesar by marriage was tied to Sulla's enemies. His young wife, Cornelia, was the daughter of Sa, the recently slain rival of Sulla. Caesar's uncle by marriage was Gas Marius, Sulla's most hated opponent. That made the teenage Caesar guilty by association. In Sulla's Rome, guilt did not require action, only connection. The dictator offered Caesar a single chance to save himself: renounce Cornelia, divorce her, break the alliance, abandon the family that Sulla despised. Many young nobles faced with the same demand obeyed without hesitation. Survival was reason enough, loyalty was flexible. But Caesar refused. Imagine that moment. 17 years old, newly fatherless, not yet famous, not yet powerful, standing before one of the most terrifying men Rome ever produced, and saying, no. It wasn't a heroic speech. It wasn't dramatic. Caesar simply refused, quietly, firmly, and that small act of defiance nearly cost him his life. Sulla reacted with cold fury. He revoked Caesar's priesthood, stripped his inheritance, confiscated his dowry, and placed him on the edge of the proscription list. Caesar suddenly became a hunted youth. Friends distanced themselves, supporters vanished. A single appearance in the wrong district could have ended his story before it began. But something remarkable happened. People intervened. Members of the Vestal priestesses, women Sulla dared not defy, petitioned for Caesar's safety. Powerful relatives whispered in the dictator's ear. Sulla reluctantly spared the boy, muttering a prophecy that chilled those who heard it. In this Caesar there are many Mariuses. He sensed danger in the teenager, ambition, charisma, potential rebellion, and so Caesar lived, but not safely, not in Rome, not under Sulla's gaze. His refusal had marked him permanently. The city he loved had become a trap, and the only escape was to run. With Sulla's wrath hanging over him like a sharpened sword, Caesar understood there was no future for him in Rome. Staying meant death. Appealing meant humiliation. Fighting meant suicide. So, at 17, with nothing but his family name, a few loyal slaves, and the clothes on his back, Caesar slipped out of the city he had been born to rule. He crossed the Italian countryside, not as a noble youth, but as a fugitive, hiding his identity, traveling by night, and avoiding every patrol loyal to Sulla's regime. This journey alone began shaping him. He learned to sleep lightly, to move quickly, to read danger in the smallest signs: distant torchlight, a snapped twig, a too curious villager. The boy who once studied poetry and rhetoric now learned the art of survival, and it hardened something inside him, a quiet resolve that would later terrify his enemies. Caesar's exile took him eastward, toward Asia Minor, where Rome's legions guarded wealthy coastal cities and rebellious mountain tribes. There he enlisted in the army, not as an honored noble or a political appointee, but as a young refugee seeking protection. His family name meant little so far from Rome. His status mattered even less. What mattered was discipline, endurance, and courage, and Caesar excelled immediately. Soldiers later recalled how impossibly composed he was for his age. He endured long marches without complaint, slept on the ground without discomfort, and trained with a seriousness unusual for someone of patrician birth. He studied the legions the way he once studied rhetoric, as if understanding each detail could someday give him power. In this, he was correct. For the first time, Caesar saw the empire from the military side, the grind of garrison duty, the danger of frontier patrols, the harsh landscapes that made Rome's expansion possible. He watched commanders negotiate with local kings, discipline rebellious troops, and use both brutality and diplomacy to keep the peace. These years weren't glamorous, but they were transformative. They pulled Caesar out of the sheltered orbit of Rome's elite and taught him how soldiers lived, marched, fought, and died. He wasn't the general yet. He wasn't the statesman. He wasn't even a rising star. But exile had given him something far more valuable than safety, clarity. He had glimpsed the world beyond Rome's marble facades and understood two truths that would guide him for life. Strength protected you, and Rome did not reward the timid. Asia Minor was not the polished marble world of Rome. It was rugged, unpredictable, and full of enemies Rome preferred not to think about. For the teenage Caesar, it became a brutal classroom, one that taught lessons far more valuable than anything offered by tutors back home. In the hills and coastal plains of the East, Caesar encountered war not as an idea, but as a living creature, violent, chaotic, and strangely intoxicating. His first real test came during a campaign against local tribes that resisted Roman control. These were not large battles, with disciplined legions maneuvering in perfect formation. They were ambushes, sharp skirmishes, and desperate charges through narrow passes where every soldier fought for his own survival. Caesar, barely 18, threw himself into the thick of it with a boldness that startled veteran legionaries. He fought not like a noble seeking glory, but like a man with something to prove, because, in truth, he did. During one battle, when the Roman standard-bearer faltered, Caesar reportedly seized the eagle standard himself, lifted it high, and plunged forward. It was a reckless move. It was also a brilliant one. The legion rallied around him, the enemy broke, and the officers took notice. Courage under fire was the first currency of Roman command, and Caesar spent it lavishly. But bravery wasn't the only skill he developed. In the camps after the battles, Caesar absorbed everything. He studied how commanders addressed their troops, how they distributed rewards, how they punished disobedience. He learned the delicate balance between fear and loyalty, a balance he would later master better than any Roman before him. And there was diplomacy. Caesar accompanied officers on missions to allied kings, where he watched negotiations unfold with all the subtlety of a stage play. He learned when to bow, when to flatter, when to threaten. A teenage exile, still technically unwelcome in Rome, was learning the foundations of both war and statecraft from the men who lived it every day. What truly changed him, however, was the camaraderie. In the legions, no one cared about his patrician ancestry. A soldier judged another soldier not by blood, but by bravery, endurance, and loyalty. Caesar earned respect the hard way by bleeding beside men who did not know his name months earlier. When he marched back into camp after those early campaigns, something in him had shifted. He was no longer the frightened boy fleeing Sulla. He was a young man who had tasted battle, earned admiration, and felt the first stirrings of destiny. The army had given him safety. War had given him purpose. As the campaigns in Asia Minor continued, Caesar's reputation spread quietly through the ranks, not as a noble-born youth playing at war, but as a soldier who could be trusted in the mud, rain, and blood of real campaigning. For a teenager, stripped of privilege and chased out of his own city, this acceptance mattered more than any Roman title he had lost. It became the foundation of the leadership style that would later make men follow him across entire continents. Caesar adapted to military discipline with startling speed. He rose before dawn with the veterans, marched under blistering sun without complaint, and carried his own pack even when others offered to carry it for him. He ate their rations, slept on their ground, laughed at their crude jokes, and listened to their stories of past battles. Soldiers remembered him as a young man, good-natured, sharp-eyed, and unusually willing to endure hardship. These qualities were rare in Roman nobles and soldiers, noticed. But endurance alone didn't set him apart. It was the charisma beginning to show beneath the discipline. Even at 18 or 19, Caesar possessed a strange magnetism. He had a way of speaking that made men lean in, a way of encouraging others that felt genuine rather than commanding. He praised courage openly, forgave mistakes quietly, and never took credit that wasn't his. This blend of humility and confidence was intoxicating to the rank and file. His officers saw something else: intelligence. Caesar grasped tactics quickly. He studied maps with interest, asked questions that showed strategic curiosity, and demonstrated a natural sense for terrain. During one patrol, he spotted an ambush before it happened, saving his cohort from slaughter. Stories like this spread, and soon even hardened centurions began watching the young fugitive with interest. But perhaps his greatest strength was adaptability. When stationed in coastal towns, Caesar blended effortlessly into diplomatic missions. When assigned to rough frontier duty, he handled it with grit. When the army needed translators, he offered his limited Greek. When it needed negotiation envoys, he volunteered to accompany elders. Every task, no matter how small, became part of his growing arsenal of skills. What he was learning quietly, steadily, was how to lead Romans by being one of them. He wasn't born with the loyalty of his future legions. He earned it here, step by step, beside campfires and battlefield graves. By the time Caesar reached 19, he had become more than a fugitive seeking refuge. He was a rising force, one shaped by hardship, sharpened by war, and beginning to sense the magnitude of his own potential. Caesar's early military career wasn't just a refuge. It became the stage for his first taste of glory. And it came during a moment of desperate chaos, when the line between survival and heroism blurred into a single heartbeat. During a campaign in Asia Minor, Caesar's unit was ambushed by enemy forces who took advantage of steep terrain and narrow roads. The attack was sudden and brutal. Roman soldiers were forced back, shields locking as arrows hissed overhead. Panic began to ripple through the ranks, the kind of panic that could turn a disciplined force into a shattered mob. But Caesar, still barely past 19, refused to retreat. Accounts differ in detail, but all agree on one point. Caesar saw a fellow soldier, an older centurion, fall wounded between the lines, trapped in a deadly no-man's land. To leave him meant certain death. To rescue him meant almost the same. Caesar didn't hesitate. He surged forward, shield raised, cutting through the chaos with reckless determination. Arrows struck the ground around him. Spears glanced off his shield rim, and somehow, impossibly, he reached the wounded centurion, lifted him onto his back, and carried him in full armor back to the Roman line. The enemy surged forward. Caesar didn't break. His fellow soldiers roared, rallying around the young man who had turned certain defeat into a spark of courage. For this act, Caesar earned the Corona Civica, the crown of oak leaves, one of Rome's highest military honors. It was awarded only to those who saved the life of another Roman in battle. And unlike most military decorations, it brought permanent privileges, public honor, reserved seating at games, and the right for others to stand in his presence. Imagine the scene. A teenage exile, stripped of wealth, hunted by Sulla, now standing before seasoned officers, as oak leaves were placed upon his head. Soldiers cheered him, officers praised him, even the harshest veterans nodded with respect. Caesar had entered the army as a nobody. In a single heroic act, he had become a name worth remembering. But the honor did more than elevate him. It ignited him. For the first time, Caesar witnessed how courage could bend fate, how bold action could carve a path through impossible circumstances. He tasted recognition, loyalty, momentum, and he realized something crucial. Rome rewarded courage far more than obedience. The oak crown wasn't just a decoration, it was a prophecy. As Caesar moved through his late teens and into his 20th year, his military career gave him more than discipline and courage. It gave him connections, education, and a deeper understanding of how power actually worked beyond Rome's marble facades. Asia Minor was not merely a battlefield. It was a crossroads of cultures, kings, merchants, philosophers, and political opportunists. And Caesar, with his sharp eyes and sharper ambition, absorbed everything around him like a thirsty sponge. Whenever the army paused in a wealthy coastal city, Caesar drifted toward its elites. He dined with Greek magistrates, observed debates in local councils, listened to philosophers argue beneath porticos, and studied how charismatic leaders shaped opinions without ever drawing a sword. In these rooms, Caesar learned that true power didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered, questioned, charmed, and persuaded. These were skills that would one day let him dominate the Roman Senate without lifting a finger. His natural charm blossomed. Even as a young man, he had what later biographers called suavitas, a blend of elegance, eloquence, and warmth. He remembered names, asked thoughtful questions, and laughed easily. People liked him. More importantly, they trusted him. Officers began sending him as a representative to allied rulers because he was respectful but not submissive, confident but not arrogant, diplomatic without being dull. Caesar learned to adjust his personality like a weapon, soft when needed, sharp when required. He also polished his Greek, the language of the educated East. Scholars recalled him practicing speeches in the evenings, shaping his rhetoric long before his first real public address in Rome. Even in exile, he prepared for the life he believed destiny owed him. But Asia Minor also introduced him to a darker lesson. Politics was a game of masks. He watched alliances form over wine one night and collapse at dawn. He saw commanders flatter kings while secretly plotting against them. He noticed how a single rumor could change a man's fate. These observations etched themselves into Caesar's teenage mind. He learned never to trust appearances, never to show his full intentions, and never to underestimate the power of perception. Caesar entered Asia Minor as a fugitive trying to survive. He was now becoming something more dangerous. A young man learning to influence minds, win hearts, and navigate political landscapes with the ease of a future ruler. The sword had taught him courage. Society was teaching him control. By the time Caesar reached his early 20s, news began drifting into the eastern camps like cautious messengers. Sulla was dying. The dictator who had chased Caesar from Rome, executed hundreds, exiled thousands, and ruled with an iron fist, now weakened by illness, withdrawing into his villa in Campa. For Caesar, this rumor was more than gossip. It was a signal. The city that had once been a death trap was beginning to loosen its grip. When Sulla finally died in 78 BCE, Caesar felt the world shift beneath him. The fear that had shadowed his adolescence didn't disappear, but it softened into something manageable. Powerful men who had once avoided him now reached out quietly. Old family friends sent letters suggesting it might be safe to come home. Even officers in Asia Minor hinted that a young man of his talent shouldn't waste his life on distant garrisons forever. And so Caesar prepared for the journey west, not as a boy running from danger, but as a young man returning with new scars, new skills, and a new sense of purpose. The road back to Italy mirrored his exile in reverse. But everything felt different now. He walked into Greek cities and understood their politics. He rode through mountain passes with a soldier's instincts. He carried himself with a confidence he had not possessed when he first left Rome. Even the men who traveled with him sensed the change. Caesar no longer looked like someone avoiding fate. He looked like someone approaching it. As he crossed the Adriatic Sea and glimpsed the Italian coastline, Caesar felt something complicated rise in his chest. Relief, pride, and a flicker of vengeance all intertwined. Rome had cast him out. Rome had tried to break him. But here he was, returning stronger than before, sharpened by hardship, and carrying honors earned not through family privilege, but through blood and bravery. He entered the city quietly, without parade or announcement. Rome was still dangerous, still factional, still scarred by civil war, but it was no longer ruled by a man who wanted him dead. Caesar visited relatives, reconnected with his mother, Aurelia, and walked through the streets he had once feared losing forever. Yet something in him had changed irrevocably. He saw Rome's corruption more clearly. He understood its weaknesses. He sensed how easily its leaders could be manipulated by fear, charm, spectacle, or ambition. Caesar had left Rome as a hunted teenager. He returned as a man who understood power, both its dangers and its possibilities. And Rome, unknowingly, had just welcomed home its future conqueror. Caesar's return to Rome did not immediately place him in the spotlight. He was still young, still relatively unknown, and still recovering from years spent as an outlaw turned soldier. But inside him, something had crystallized. The hardships of exile, the dangers of Sulla's regime, the discipline of military life, the lessons of diplomacy, all of it fused into a new identity. Caesar was no longer merely a noble youth of ancient lineage. He was a man building himself from the ground up. Rome, however, hadn't changed as much as he had hoped. The Republic was fractured, riddled with resentments left over from the civil wars. Veterans loyal to Sulla dominated politics. Senators whispered behind closed doors, fearful of new uprisings. Corruption seeped through the courts, and ambition poisoned every conversation. Caesar recognized the cracks instantly. The city was unstable, vulnerable even, and for the first time, he began to imagine not how he might survive Rome, but how he might shape it. But ambition alone wasn't enough. Caesar needed influence, training, and visibility. So, he turned to what he had always understood best, rhetoric. Though still in his early 20s, he began practicing law as an advocate, honing his voice until it could slice through a crowd as cleanly as a blade. He took on cases others avoided. Corrupt governors, mistreated allies, victims of political abuse. Romans began to notice his fire, his fearlessness, his refusal to bow to the powerful. These early speeches were risky, even reckless. The men he attacked were wealthy, connected, and vicious. But Caesar had learned courage in the mountains of Asia Minor. Standing before hostile juries didn't compare to charging through enemy spears. Rome's political dangers felt manageable compared to real war. At the same time, Caesar invested in alliances, small ones at first. He befriended young politicians like himself, men disillusioned with the Senate's aging aristocracy. He joined intellectual circles, attended lavish banquets, charmed influential matrons, and did what he always excelled at, winning hearts. Every handshake mattered, every conversation planted seeds. Every appearance built the image of a rising star who had survived tyranny without becoming timid. And beneath it all, he carried Sulla's bitter prophecy. In this Caesar, there are many Mariuses. Caesar didn't forget those words. He embraced them. His teenage years had begun with fear, loss, and flight. They ended with confidence, purpose, and an emerging vision of what Rome could become under his rule. The boy who escaped the dictator would not run again.